For the first time, Victoria allowed a bit of rigidity in her body to dissolve. "I don't know if I can trust again," she admitted. "I'm not asking you to trust me right away," Isabella said with an encouraging smile. "But let me try to help. Let's take it one step at a time. I have space in my home. You can stay with me until we find a better solution." Victoria looked at Yeppy, who was gazing at her with hope and tenderness. Finally, she nodded, allowing the tears to fall. "I accept." Isabella smiled, and in that moment, something shifted. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in years, they were all moving toward healing. The first rays of morning light illuminated Isabella's cozy, modern living room, where Yeppy and Victoria had settled the night before. The elegant furniture and warm atmosphere contrasted sharply with the harsh reality they had faced on the streets. Sitting in an armchair by a large window, Isabella watched the sunrise, a hot cup of coffee warming her hands. This wasn't just an act of charity. It was an attempt to heal old wounds, to forgive, and perhaps to find peace. Victoria hesitated in the doorway, still adjusting to the idea of being under Isabella's roof. There was something poignant about seeing the once proud and fierce woman now so fragile, her shoulders hunched under the weight of years and sorrows. Yet in her tired eyes, there was a new spark, perhaps hope. "You're up early," Isabella said with a slight smile, motioning to the sofa beside her. "Would you like some coffee?" Victoria hesitated, as if debating whether to accept the kindness, then slowly sat down. "Yes, I'd like some. Thank you." Isabella poured a cup and handed it to her. Victoria held it with both hands, letting the warmth soothe her cold fingers. The silence between them was heavy but not hostile. "I still can't believe I'm here," Victoria murmured, staring into her cup. "If someone had told me years ago that I would accept your help, I would have laughed in their face." "I get it," Isabella said gently. "And to be honest, I never imagined we'd be here together after everything that happened." Victoria took a deep breath, as if preparing for a difficult confession. "I never looked at you favorably, Isabella. When Emmanuel first spoke of you, I knew you were different from what I had envisioned for him. I always wanted the best for my son. I thought he needed someone who could help him rise in life." Isabella remained silent, allowing Victoria to open up at her own pace. "But now, I see how wrong I was," Victoria continued, her voice trembling. "I lost my son. I lost my life. And for so long, I blamed you. I blamed you for taking Emmanuel away, for being the reason for our misfortunes. But the truth is, what happened was much bigger than any of us." A knot tightened in Isabella's throat. She had never expected to hear those words. "I never wanted to take him away from you," Isabella said softly. "I loved Emmanuel, but I know he loved you both too. The decision to distance himself wasn't easy for him. He always wanted to please everyone." Victoria nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I was blinded by pain and pride. I fed that resentment for years, and it destroyed us. Not just me, but Yeppy too. When Emmanuel left, I lost my footing. Now, after so many years, I see that you weren't to blame. I just didn't know how to cope with the loss." Isabella felt her own tears welling up. "We all lost, Victoria. I lost the love of my life, and you lost your son. We suffered in different ways, but neither of us came out unscathed." Victoria quickly wiped her tears, trying to maintain some dignity. "I don't know how to thank you for helping us now, after everything I put you through." "I don't want thanks," Isabella said with compassion. "I just want all of us to find some peace. Guilt and resentment have eaten away at us for too long. It's time to let them go, if not for ourselves, then for Emmanuel." Victoria smiled, a small, timid, yet genuine smile. "He would be happy to see this, wouldn't he?" "Yes," Isabella whispered, her eyes misty. "He would." At that moment, Yeppy entered the room, his presence bringing a different energy. He seemed more relaxed, as if having a roof over his head and a comfortable bed had renewed him. "You two are talking?" he asked with a light smile. "That's a good sign." Victoria and Isabella exchanged glances and laughed softly. "Yes, Yeppy, we're talking," Isabella said, waving him over. "I think we're starting to put the past in its place." Yeppy sighed in relief and sat beside Victoria, gently taking her hand. I always knew what we had wasn't living. The pain swallowed us. But now, maybe we have a second chance. Isabella nodded. You have a place here for as long as you need. But I hope that, with time, we can find something more permanent for you. You deserve a fresh start. Victoria squeezed Yeppy's hand, a shy smile forming on her lips. Thank you, Isabella. Maybe this is our chance to finally let Emmanuel rest in peace. Weeks passed, and Yeppy and Victoria gradually adjusted to their new life. With Isabella's support, they found a small but welcoming home in a quiet neighborhood. Moving in was an emotional moment. But for the first time in years, they had a place to call their own. On their first night in their new home, as Isabella said goodbye, Yeppy embraced her warmly. You've given us something we can never repay, the chance to be a family again. You don't need to repay me, Isabella said, moved. Just live this new life with love and gratitude. That's more than enough. Victoria, who had once hesitated to show her emotions, stepped forward and hugged Isabella tightly as well. I never thought I could forgive or move on, but now I see that forgiveness sets us free, and I'm grateful for this chance. We're all healing together, Isabella said, looking at both of them with an affectionate smile. And Emmanuel would be happy to see this. As Isabella walked away, leaving Yeppy and Victoria at the threshold of their new home, she felt a lightness in her heart. The past had been painful, but finally, they were all finding a way to peace. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to be the first to receive our next video. Share with your friends, and check out the video on the end screen. You'll be moved. Yeppy looked at Isabella, his expression a mix of shock and sorrow. I never knew you were with him. Isabella shook her head, struggling to control her emotions. I loved him with all my heart, she whispered, and I lost everything that day. She had tried to move on, but the past had always lingered in the shadows. Yeppy, on the other hand, had sunk deeper into sadness and regret until his life had become what she saw now, an old, weary man surviving among the ruins of his losses. I can't believe it, Yeppy murmured, shaking his head slowly. You were the woman he loved, and I never knew how much that meant to him. Isabella quickly wiped her tears, struggling to maintain her composure. I didn't know he was your son until now, but when I saw the watch, it all came back. The memories, everything. He always wore this watch, the gift I gave him when we started planning our future together. Yeppy seemed lost in his own thoughts, his eyes fixed on the past. He spoke little about you, he admitted in almost a whisper, but I knew something was pulling him away from us. Victoria, my wife, she never accepted the idea of Emmanuel being with someone outside our world. She always wanted him to marry someone from society, someone who could elevate our status. His voice trembled, heavy with guilt and sadness. Isabella nodded, understanding perfectly. She hated me. Whenever I tried to get close, I felt her disdain. And Emmanuel, try please everyone, was caught between two realities. He was a good man, Yeppy. He wanted to make everyone happy, but it tore him apart. Yeppy took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly on the table. I never imagined it would end this way. After he was gone, Victoria and I drifted even further apart. She blamed herself, and deep down, I think she blamed me too. That's when everything started to crumble. Isabella looked at him with deep empathy. And how did you end up here? She asked softly, choosing her words carefully to avoid reopening old wounds. Yeppy let out a weary sigh, the weight of his story pressing down on him. After Emmanuel died, Victoria was never the same. She sank into grief, and I lost my footing too. Our marriage couldn't withstand it. The guilt, the mourning, it drove us apart. I distanced myself from everything. We had a comfortable life once, but the emptiness he left behind was unbearable. His voice faltered. Victoria always blamed me. She said that if I had been firmer with Emmanuel, he would have chosen a different path, stayed away from you. And in my weakness, I believed it for a long time. Hearing this, Isabella felt a heavy weight in her chest. It wasn't easy to hear that Victoria had seen her as the reason for their family's collapse. Yeppy, she said gently. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. Sometimes life takes us down paths we can't foresee or control. What happened was an accident, but the love Emmanuel had for you, and for me, that love was real. None of this can be diminished by blame. Yeppie looked at her with tear-filled eyes, visibly touched by her words. I never thought I would meet you, that I would discover who the woman my son loved truly was. This means so much to me. Isabella reached across the table, lightly touching Yeppie's hand. We both share the same loss, and that connects us. I don't know why fate brought us together today, but maybe it means something. For a few moments, they sat in silence, processing the weight of their revelations. The watch was still in Isabella's hands, and she carefully returned it to Yeppie. He placed it back on his wrist with a solemn expression. This watch, Isabella said softly, is more than just an accessory. It's a symbol of the time we spent with him, of what we shared. And as painful as it is, it also reminds me that time continues to pass. We need to find a way to move forward. Yeppie smiled sadly, understanding the depth of her words. I don't know how to move on, he admitted. After we lost everything, Victoria and I ended up on the streets. And now we're just surviving. Isabella felt a surge of empathy so strong it made her shift in her chair. And where's Victoria now? She asked, her heart tightening. Yeppie lowered his head. She's waiting for me in a nearby square. We have nowhere to go. And she's even more broken than I am. Isabella took a deep breath, sensing that something greater needed to be done. I want to see Victoria, she said firmly. I want to help both of you. I can't change the past, but maybe I can help improve the future. Her heart raced as she walked alongside Yeppie through the bustling streets. The words they had exchanged in the café still echoed in her mind. The father of the man she had loved was beside her, leading her toward the woman who had once despised her. Isabella knew this meeting would be difficult, but something inside her told her it was the right thing to do. Yeppie guided her in silence, his steps slow and weary, as though the weight of the years had drained his strength. Isabella's eyes wandered through the city, but her thoughts were a whirlwind. Reuniting with Victoria was something she had never imagined. Finally, they arrived at a small, worn square nestled between old buildings. It was quiet, with a few people sitting on benches or strolling. Under the shade of a large tree sat Victoria. The contrast between the woman Isabella had once known and the frail figure before her was stark. Once proud and immaculate, Victoria was now hunched over, wrapped in an old, tattered coat. Her gray hair was carelessly tied back, and her once sharp, commanding eyes were now dull and distant. Yeppie approached carefully, as if afraid to wake a sleeping beast. Isabella followed, her heart in her throat. As they neared, Victoria lifted her gaze, her expression shifting from exhaustion to alarm at the sight of a stranger. "Yeppie," she murmured, her voice hoarse. "Who is this woman?" Yeppie hesitated, then spoke gently. "Victoria, this is Isabella. She was someone very important to Emmanuel." The name fell between them like a stone in a still lake, sending ripples of tension through the air. Victoria's eyes widened in shock, then darkened with old resentment. "Isabella," she said, her voice laced with disbelief and anger. You are the woman who took him away from us, the cause of all our misery." The accusation cut deep, but Isabella steadied herself. She took a deep breath, determined to stay calm. "Victoria, I understand that you see me this way," she said, her voice firm yet gentle. "But I'm here to help. We can't change the past, but maybe we can find a way to move forward." Victoria shook her head, gripping the bag beside her. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I lost everything. My son, my life, nothing makes sense anymore." Yeppie knelt beside her, holding her hands. "Dear, I know you've suffered. I have too, but Isabella wants to help us. Maybe it's time to stop running from the past." Victoria looked between them, her expression torn between wounded pride and longing. Finally, she sighed a long, tired breath. "I don't know what to say." Yeppie squeezed her hands. "Just say you'll accept help. We've lived this way for so long. Maybe it's time for a change." Tears welled in Victoria's eyes, and for the first time in years, hope flickered in the ruins of her grief. Yeppy finally spoke, his voice a fragile mix of curiosity and sorrow. "Why didn't I ever know about you?" Isabella took a deep breath, bracing herself to reopen wounds she had spent years trying to heal. "It's a long story," she said, looking into the eyes of a man who, just moments ago, had been a stranger, but now felt like a link to a past she had never truly left behind. "But I think we need to talk." She held Emmanuel's watch delicately, as if afraid it might shatter in her hands. Every worn detail, the faint shine, the discreet engraving, the way Emmanuel used to absent-mindedly twist it on his wrist while they talked, came rushing back, overwhelming her with memories. Yeppy watched her closely, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He recognized that look. It was the same pain he had carried for years, the pain of losing Emmanuel. The connection between them, undeniable and profound, settled like a weight between them. "He never mentioned you," Yeppy said, his voice hoarse. It wasn't an accusation, just a painful realization. "Not once." Isabella exhaled slowly, still gripping the watch. "I don't know where to begin," she admitted. Her heart ached, heavy with everything she had lost. "I met Emmanuel when we were young. I worked at a boutique, my first job in the city. He used to stop by with donations for the orphanage where I grew up. That's how we got close." Yeppy's eyes widened. "Orphanage." She nodded, a faraway sadness settling in her gaze. "Yes, I was raised there from the time I was a child. I never knew my parents, but the orphanage became my home. And Emmanuel, he was the first person who made me feel like I belonged." Her voice trembled as she continued. "He was kind, devoted, so full of life. We had so many plans for the future, until fate changed everything." Yeppy fell silent, absorbing her words. He had spent years grieving his son, but now, for the first time, he realized there was an entire part of Emmanuel's life he had never known, a love he had never been told about, a piece of his son's heart that had been kept from him. His throat tightened. "I never knew about that part of his life," he murmured, lowering his gaze. "After Emmanuel died, Victoria, my wife, always blamed someone. She used to say he distanced himself because of a woman, but she never told me the details. All I knew was that after his death, nothing was the same." At the mention of Victoria, Isabella shuddered. She didn't need an explanation to know exactly who Yeppy was talking about. She remembered the cold, piercing looks, the disapproving silence. Emmanuel's mother had always loomed over them like an unmovable wall. "Victoria never accepted me," Isabella admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "She never thought I was good enough for her son, and that created a chasm between Emmanuel and his family. He was torn between trying to be the perfect son and wanting to live his own life. It was," she swallowed hard, "it was a very difficult time." Yeppy looked up, his expression raw. He had never truly understood why Emmanuel had drifted away. Victoria had convinced him that the woman in their son's life was the reason for the distance. And for years, he had believed it. But now, sitting across from Isabella, seeing the pain in her eyes, he realized the truth was far more complicated. "He never stopped visiting me," Yeppy admitted with a tired sigh. "But it was rare." Then his voice faltered, growing weaker. And then the accident happened. A sharp pang shot through Isabella's chest. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment where memory blurred into tragedy. Yeppy's hands trembled as he spoke. "That day it all happened so fast. Emmanuel was with someone, but I never knew exactly what happened. He was gone." His gaze dropped to the watch in Isabella's hands. And the only thing that remained was this. Isabella's fingers tightened around the watch as if it were the last piece of Emmanuel she had left. She closed her eyes, the weight of the past pressing down on her. "I was with him," she finally confessed, her voice breaking. "We were heading to a friend's house together, but we never made it." Her breath hitched as she fought against the memories clawing their way back to the surface. The car, there was an accident. It all happened so fast. When I woke up, he was already gone. Her voice cracked, and at last, the tears she had been holding back spilled over. She covered her face with her hands, allowing herself, for the first time in years, to fully feel the pain of that moment. Yeppy sat in silence, watching her with glassy eyes. His own tears fell, tracing the deep lines on his weary face. "I never knew," he whispered. His voice was broken, raw with regret. "I never knew." And for the first time, the weight of all the years of misunderstanding, of blame, of loss, settled between them. Not as a barrier, but as a shared grief. As two people who had loved the same man and lost him too soon. An 89-year-old frail man stepped into a bustling café, his tired eyes scanning the room as he approached the counter. His presence went unnoticed at first, but as soon as he spoke, a simple request for a sandwich, he was met with disdain. The cafe owner, Marcella, looked him over with a cold, disgusted expression. "This isn't a homeless shelter, old man," she scoffed. "If you don't have money, you don't eat." Yeppy, as he was known, felt a lump in his throat. His trembling fingers placed a few worn coins on the counter. "Please, anything you can spare." "I'm hungry," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of the customers. Laughter rippled through the cafe. Someone shook their head with a smirk. "Get out of here, old man. We don't want your kind around." Yeppy's shoulders slumped under the weight of humiliation. He knew he should leave, but his empty stomach begged him to stay. His legs, however, refused to move. Then, the door swung open. A sudden hush fell over the room as an elegantly dressed woman entered. Her presence commanded attention. Isabella, a well-known figure in the city, owner of luxury boutiques, and a woman of quiet authority. She took in the scene before her sharp gaze locking onto Yeppy, then flicking towards something on his wrist. Her breath hitched. Her face went pale. Without hesitation, she strode toward the counter. "What's going on here?" Her voice was calm, yet carried a weight that made Marcella falter. "This man can't pay," Marcella said defensively. "We don't serve people like him." Isabella's expression darkened. "People like him?" she repeated, her voice steady but laced with quiet anger. "You mean a human being who's hungry? Or do you mean someone you think is beneath you?" The cafe fell into stunned silence. Customers, who moments ago had been entertained by Yeppy's suffering, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Isabella turned to Yeppy, her voice softening. "Sir, your lunch is on me today." Yeppy looked up, disbelief flickering in his weary eyes. Marcella crossed her arms. "We don't do charity here." Isabella let out a soft chuckle, though her gaze remained piercing. "Charity is a choice. Humanity shouldn't be." She reached into her purse and placed money on the counter. "He has the same right to sit and eat here as anyone else." Marcella hesitated, knowing that challenging Isabella could damage her reputation. Gritting her teeth, she muttered, "Fine, but this won't happen again." Isabella smiled, calm yet triumphant. "What won't happen again, Marcella, is the way you treat people here. And trust me, I'll make sure everyone knows." Marcella paled. Around the cafe, customers exchanged uneasy glances, some ashamed, others contemplative. A waiter, now emboldened, led Yeppy to a table. Isabella followed, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "Now, sir," she said warmly, "what would you like to eat? Order anything you want." Yeppy, his voice thick with emotion, murmured, I don't know how to thank you, ma'am." Isabella simply smiled. "Then don't. Just eat." Isabella smiled, shaking her head. "No need to thank me. Yeppy, let's start with a good meal and then we can talk." She watched closely as a reluctant waiter placed a sandwich and a cup of coffee in front of Yeppy, though his movements lacked enthusiasm under Isabella's firm gaze. He didn't dare show any resistance. Yeppy stared at the plate, his expression a mix of disbelief and gratitude. His trembling fingers hesitated over the bread, as if afraid the moment would vanish like a fragile dream. "You can eat," Isabella encouraged with a warm smile, her tone now softer. "It's yours. You deserve it." Yeppy nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He took his first bite, and for the first time in what felt like forever, hunger overtook shame. Slowly, he chewed, savoring each morsel, while Isabella sat in silence, watching him. But something stirred inside her. something beyond mere compassion. It was a strange, inexplicable connection to this man. Around them, the cafe returned to a forced sense of normalcy. Marcella, still simmering from Isabella's intervention, whispered to her staff, throwing sharp glances toward their table. Yet the air remained thick with something unresolved, as if fate had one more revelation waiting in the wings. As Isabella absent-mindedly adjusted her bag on the table, a flicker of light caught her eye. She glanced at Yeppy's wrist and froze. A watch. At first, it seemed unremarkable, but then a familiarity crept in. The shape, the style, something about it tugged at a buried memory. Her heart quickened. "Mr. Yeppy," she said, her voice laced with sudden curiosity. "May I see your watch?" Yeppy blinked in confusion. He looked down at his wrist, as if only now remembering the worn accessory. "Oh, of course," he murmured, carefully unfastening the strap. As he placed it in her hands, he added softly, "It was a keepsake from someone very important." Isabella's fingers trembled as they closed around a cool metal, a ghost from the past. Slowly, she turned the watch over, and the moment her eyes landed on the engraving, her breath hitched. "Emmanuel." A sharp gasp escaped her lips. Her hand flew to her mouth as her world tilted. This watch, it was the same one she had gifted long ago to the only man she had ever truly loved. The man who had meant everything to her. The man she had lost. Her fingers traced the name as if trying to confirm reality. How had this watch ended up here? How had it come to belong to Yeppy? Her voice trembled as she finally asked, Where did you get this?" Yeppy, sensing the deep emotion in her eyes, hesitated. "It was a gift," he said slowly. "A gift from my son, Emmanuel." The word struck Isabella like a physical blow. Her suspicions were true. Yeppy's son, his Emmanuel, was the same Emmanuel she had loved, the same Emmanuel whose absence had left an unfillable void in her life. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the weight of the revelation settled on her chest. Yeppy sighed, his eyes heavy with years of loss. He passed away many years ago," he murmured. "After he left, life was never the same." A lump formed in Isabella's throat. She fought back the tears threatening to spill, but the ache was unbearable. Emmanuel had vanished from her life without warning. She had never gotten to say goodbye, never gotten closure. And now, sitting before her, was his father, a man worn by time and tragedy, clutching the last tangible piece of the love she had lost. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. He was the words caught in her throat. Yeppy stared at her, his tired eyes searching hers. "You knew my son?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella nodded, unable to speak right away. When she finally found her voice, it was laced with raw, unfiltered pain. "I loved him," she confessed, her words barely audible. "I loved him more than anything in this world." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Yeppy's eyes widened in shock, struggling to absorb the truth. And Isabella, still clutching the watch as though it were the last thread tying her to the past, felt her heart shatter all over again. This was no longer just an encounter in a cafe. It was fate, and fate had just rewritten everything she thought she had lost.